Thank you, Anthony, for organizing this, and thank you to the philosopher for hosting it, and thank you also to my college, University College Oxford, for sponsoring this series. The events that were taking place just before this broadcast began are one manifestation of an historical event that is likely to cause anxiety among many people. But the motivation for this series was a more general kind of historical anxiety, and that is one that manifests itself in different forms in our relation to the past and present. Ambivalence about our relationship to the past, which is something that we'll be discussing today. A disorienting sense of ever accelerating change. Fear of unpredictable and an uncontrollable future. And those were going to be subjects of the future talks in this series, seminars in this series. So, and historical anxiety, as I'm conceiving it, occurs when established understandings of time and of history no longer really seem adequate to actual historical developments. And so I wanted to begin today with someone who's written a lot about collective memory, historical past, and the kinds of ways that the historical past survives into the present or can be reactivated in the present. And with that, I think I'll turn it over directly to Jeffrey, whom I also thank for agreeing to start off this seminar series.
Switch on the book. Now it should be okay. My thanks go to Nick and also to Anthony for the invitation. It's a great pleasure and honor to be here with you and to speak about a topic that is very important to me. What I would like to do is very briefly talk a little bit about the theoretical presuppositions that underlie the concept of the passive presence of the historical past. And I'll simply mention three aspects of it very quickly, and then dive into the example, which is the example of the American past, the past of the United States in the period following the Civil War and during American Reconstruction up to the present. And I would like to take a very important example from novel and film. So the three presuppositions I want to mention is first a term called the horizon of contemporaneity, which I deal with in my book, Collective Memory in the Historical Past. And by the horizon of contemporaneity, I mean the temporal space encompassing all living generations, from the oldest to the youngest, in a given contemporaneous present. And I distinguish this horizon of contemporaneity from the historical past beyond the purview of all possible experience of the different generations living in a given period. The second point I would like to emphasize is that the experience of contemporaneously living generations, whether personal and group experience of direct encounters in the life world, or public experience that is most often indirectly conveyed by the mass media, this experience is made communicable insofar as it is symbolically embodied in memory and conveyed through language and image, gesture, and style. The third point is that symbolically embodied and remembered experience is fragmented. It's fragmented according to the perspective of different social groups that retain it. With the passage of time, each of these living generations grows older, its members disappear, and all direct recollection by posterity of these forebears and of the past that was their present fades beyond the horizon of all living memory. The vestiges they leave are received by the generations that follow within the new temporal horizon in the altered symbolic context of a later period. So we can say that the pastness of the no longer contemporaneous world is most immediately attested by ruins, monuments, museum objects, archives, documents, obsolete linguistic usages, outmoded styles and fashions, gestures, and other traces. And these vestiges stand at the temporal margins of the present, which, unless they are actively recalled by a given present, remain as passively given remnants of a bygone world. The passive subsistence of inherited conventions, institutions, mores, arising out of the temporal depths of the historical past continues to tacitly mold the interaction of all contemporaneous social groups in a given present. And among the vestiges of this past, we may also identify the traces of an historical past lying beyond all living memory that the predominant contemporaneous social groups have obscured. Where these vestiges arouse little historical interest, or they may even be a source of great discomfort, the historical past from which they arise may also persist in the fragmented perspective of non-dominant social groups. They exist in the guise of a passive presence reflected in the attitudes handed down from generation to generation and attested by neglected testimonies and other obscured traces. So I wanted simply to present this very brief theoretical introduction and jump into the example now. The example is taken from the period beginning in 1865, which ended the American Civil War. 1863 was the date of the Emancipation Proclamation, ending slavery in the United States. And as you know, after 1865, and between 1865 and 1877, the Northern Union troops occupied the South, and they made sure that the civil rights of Blacks were protected. They abolished, they made illegal the Ku Klux Klan, in other words, the group favoring white supremacy among the Southerners, vigilante groups that were then made illegal after the Act of 1871. Now, the point I want to make, and here we begin to delve into the question of the passive presence, is that immediately during this period, in other words, the years between 1865 and 1877, when the Northern troops withdrew from the South, and the South was again granted its independence, what is important is during this period, even though the Northern troops were no longer there after 1877, nonetheless, the situation didn't change in any radical way. Black males continued to vote in the Southern states after 1877, and their votes were solicited in this post-bellum period in which public discrimination against Blacks was not sanctioned by legal institutions. So this is a very important point, that even though the Northern troops were not there, things continued more or less as they were. And then a generation later, it was as the older generations, the soldiers who participated in the war, and the people who had experience, as they began to disappear and die out, all of a sudden later generations who had never experienced it began to draw on the fragmented memories in order to impose a very new kind of system that became virulent and violent, especially in the years after 1900. In other words, 2 generations after the end of the Civil War and after the withdrawal of the Northern troops from the South, it took that long for all of a sudden these fragmented memories to be reenacted and to turn into political mythologies. These are, of course, the famous years of the Jim Crow legislations that discriminated against Blacks and made it almost impossible in many states for them to vote. So I will skip from here to what is in fact in a certain sense, the most important sign of this regression, this repression, this period in which fragmented memories of the dominant population in the South, the whites, all of a sudden became virulent in their opposition, their imposition of racial inequality, and their domination over the Black population. Here I will note the publication in 1905 of a very important bestseller, a bestseller that was read by nearly everybody, especially in the South. It was written by Thomas Dixon. Thomas Dixon, best-selling historical novel called, it's titled The Klansman, an historical romance of the Ku Klux Klan. And it was dedicated to the memory of Dixon's uncle, who in the years after the formation of the Ku Klux Klan presented a kind of apology for the white slave owners. And of course presented the assumption regarding the readiness of Black males to violate the honor of white females, etc. All of the stereotypes that we're familiar with that were portrayed in this novel. But this novel, in fact, goes a bit further, because he links this new oppression of the Blacks and this idea of white supremacy and superiority to what he calls, in the preface to the novel that was included in it, I quote him, "the unity of the racial life of the people," and in which he says that it's one of the most dramatic chapters in the history of the Aryan race. So you see that this man is very conscious of kind of racial theory that was floating in the air more generally in this period. What I would like to say is that this novel, The Klansman, undoubtedly would have been forgotten if it were simply taken on its rather meager merits. It's not really a very good book. It's not all that well written, and it's rather an over-dramatization and melodramatic presentation of a kind of mythical situation. But it became very well known because the best friend of Dixon was D.W. Griffith, the young D.W. Griffith, who took the plot basis of The Klansman and made it into an early silent film, very famous early silent film that became a pioneering work of cinematographic history. Everybody recognizes the title, The Birth of a Nation, the famous film of silent film of D.W. Griffith. Now, why did it become so popular? What is it that made this film, because it was not just one film among other films, but rather it became very popular because Dixon's classmate in school in a southern state somewhat earlier, and one of his very close friends happened to be Woodrow Wilson, who was then president of the United States. And you'll remember that Woodrow Wilson himself was an historian, a professor at Princeton University, who wrote a multi-volume history of the American people. And it was published in 1901, and one needs only consult Woodrow Wilson's book, in which he talks about the Reconstruction period after the Civil War as a veritable overthrow of civilization in the South. I quote him. And he talks about the political ineptitude of the Blacks who were easily manipulated by opportunists and adventurers. And so what's interesting in D.W. Griffith's film is that it's a silent film, but as in many silent films of the period, there are also written passages. You know, you have the pictures and then all of a sudden the written passages. And many of the written passages were taken directly from Woodrow Wilson's chapters on Reconstruction in History of the American People. He simply verbatim took some of the passages out. And the film, of course, created quite a stir when it came out because it was seen as racially very biased, which it was. the cinemas in which it was shown were subject to boycott and demonstrations. This was also the period of formation of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and they organized boycotts all around places where, big cities where the film was being shown. And so what was Woodrow Wilson's reaction? He decided to organize a private showing of The Birth of the Nation at the White House in the presence of the cabinet. And he also projected it at another showing before members of the United States Supreme Court and the assembled Congress. And Wilson commented to his friend Dixon, I quote Wilson in a comment that he made. Wilson said, "Your book is like writing history with lightning, and my only regret is that it is all so terribly true." You see that all of a sudden, this film, which was really disseminating a political mythology more than anything else, all of a sudden became socially acceptable. And a lot of cinemas all of a sudden began showing it, and it was widely circulated among the general public. I'm not going to go into great detail, but I think one point here should be mentioned, and that is that this film had a real impact on life itself, because it coincided with the rebirth of the Ku Klux Klan, a much more virulent and violent version of this vigilante group that was refounded in 1915 under Colonel William Simmons, the first Imperial Wizard. And a lot of the mythological figures and images that one sees in A Birth of a Nation were adopted by the new Ku Klux Klan that had never existed before, like burning crosses on a hillside. This all came from the film, and this sort of thing. And I quote, to talk about the great influence of the film among the American public, I quote a generation later, Margaret Mitchell. You're all familiar with the name of Margaret Mitchell, who is a great admirer of the novel of Dixon. And when she published her novel, Gone with the Wind, which was a kind of softer depiction of race relations in the antebellum and wartime South, nonetheless, if you look carefully at the novel, the Ku Klux Klan is portrayed in a rather favorable light. Although in the film, all mention of the Ku Klux Klan is taken out. And the aging Dixon wrote to congratulate Margaret Mitchell on her novel. And she wrote back to Dixon, and I quote Margaret Mitchell, who said, "I was practically raised on your books and love them very much." You can see this film, the novel itself, and especially the film, had a very great impact. I will not go there. Time is pressing, and so I will not go into the influence of the political mythology and other sectors of the population. I could mention a long list of historians after Woodrow Wilson who adopted all of these stereotypes about Blacks, about Reconstruction, and et cetera. People like William Archibald Dunning at Columbia University, or E.M. Coulter, who was the most famous and influential American historian of the South. I mentioned only also in passing that this was also the period of the first of the revisionist historians, a Black historian we're all familiar with named W.E.B. Du Bois, who in 1935 published his famous book, Black Reconstruction in America. In this famous book, Black Reconstruction in America, he did a lot of research in archives and in all state legislatures and all sorts of places to recover this passive presence of the historical past. But I mentioned to end this part of my talk, this book was completely ignored when it was published, and the American Historical Association did not even review it. in the American Historical Review. It was simply completely shunted to the side, and nobody paid any attention to it. And it was only after the Second World War that the situation began to change. I'll end this example by referring to Martin Luther King, the very year of the March on Washington. Another generation later, generation and a half, one of the most important criticisms of Martin Luther King was historiography. Professional historians of the United States and the way that they had disseminated this myth about Reconstruction. I quote Martin Luther King in an article that he wrote the same year as his March on Washington. Among these myths, according to King, was the particularly pernicious, and I quote him, almost universally accepted concept that civilization had collapsed in the South during Reconstruction because Negroes had a measure of political power. So I think the time is pressing quite a bit, and we could go into a whole list of revisionist historians who began to dispel after Dubois and after the Second World War, historians who began to really investigate, to look into the archives, to look into the state legislature records, to look into all sorts of details that constituted the heretofore passive presence of a past that nobody really wanted to look into. Historians like John Hope Franklin at the University of Chicago, who wrote a fantastic article on Dixon's novel and the film that was based by Griffith that was based on it. John Hope Franklin, C. Van Woodward, Kenneth Stamp, Eric Foner, these are names of revisionist historians who all of a sudden began to take an active interest in what had previously been completely shunted to the side. I've spoken almost half an hour. Do I have, we could start with the theoretical part in the discussion now about what this means exactly, or I can keep going if you, whatever you prefer.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Why don't we talk about, because you've raised a number of very important issues, and I'm glad that you mentioned Martin Luther King too, not least because today is, among other things, Martin Luther King Day.
Exactly.
And also, I mean, there are two aspects of the passive presence of the historical past that you referred to. One is that the latter one you referred to is the one that was recovered by these revisionist historians, but then the earlier one was that recovered or reawakened in the initial kind of nostalgia for the antebellum South and by the Jim Crow laws and so on. And that one is, still very much with us, of course. And there are different phenomena that are directly related to it, such as the renaming of schools in the South, which had been in 2020. Between 2021 and 20 and 21, 61 schools in the South changed their names from after they were named after Confederate figures, and then they were changed to non-Confederate figures. That's now beginning to reverse itself. And so, the BBC reported in August of last year that a Stonewall Jackson school was recovering that name, Stonewall Jackson, the Confederate general, with considerable controversy. And so that seems to be another kind of example of this in our contemporary presence. But I suppose you could also say that the kind of nostalgic reinvocation of fascism in Italy, or even Stalinist Russia in Russia, would be related phenomenon. That is, there's a gap, there's a hiatus between those who've experienced this directly and then those who are then invoking its memory for some reason. And that raised an interesting question about, what constitutes the passive aspect of it, but also does it require some kind of lifting of a taboo that makes it accessible again? Is there so it's not just passage of time, but also some kind of taboo.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I'll give you another example taken that is related to my example, and that is the construction of Confederate monuments.
Yeah.
You mentioned schools, which is also part of the same phenomenon. This is something else. It didn't begin right after the Civil War. That's what's interesting. It didn't, the two generations following the Civil War were not interested in constructing monuments. Those who had actually lived through it, or in the time when when the contemporaneous memory of living generations was still alive, there was no interest in making monuments. It was two generations later, especially in the 1890s and up until 1910, there was all of a sudden this craze almost. And the best example is, of course, Richmond, Virginia, where the famous statue of Robert E. Lee was put up in the 1890s, was quite late. And afterward, they created this huge monument avenue that today has become so controversial. This Monument Avenue, which was, kind of the active presence of a past of all of these generals and statesmen of the Confederate States who were all supporting slavery on one of the most prominent boulevards of what had been the capital of the Confederacy. So all of this was there to kind of in reviving a fragmented memory of the past and kind of embalming it in these huge stone monuments, was in fact disseminating this political mythology as well. And so what's interesting here is that after all of these years of the civil rights movement, all of these years where I thought, that this was all of a sudden we turned a page and people all of a sudden begun to understand that, people were basically politically equal. All of a sudden, everybody remembers several years ago when all of these Nazis and racists, all of a sudden, Ku Klux Klanners all began to demonstrate precisely in Monument Avenue of Richmond, Virginia, and other cities, but especially there was the very, very controversial area in which this passive presence of another past came back. The passive presence of a past that we thought had been set aside, this racist past, this past of a political mythology that had done so much damage under the Ku Klux Klan in the early parts of the 20th century. All of a sudden, the fragmented memories of this were rekindled. And this is the anxiety part of it, the way in which things that we think have been vanquished or have been finally understood to be irrational and unacceptable, that they have a way of reintroducing the return of the repressed, one could almost say, which is really the anxiety-provoking moment that all of these phenomena possess. So it's not, it can go in all sorts of different directions, this return of the repressed, this return of this passive presence where it's activated and becomes can become quite violent and dangerous.
Hmm. And of course, this involves an element of nostalgia, but it's nostalgia not in the sense of a childhood, that it's not an experience one could have had, or an experience indeed that anyone could have had, but it's much more like a projection into the past. But it seems to need, that's the interesting thing, it seems to have the need to focus on these embodied objects,
Yeah, one of the theoretical conclusions that I reached in writing the original paper that I did, because I just gave a very small part of it, it's actually written as a critical response to a kind of theories that were floating around in the 1960s and 70s. I'm thinking of Roland Barthes and of Hayden White and a number of other people who wrote kind of emphasizing the fictive aspects
Yeah.
of historical writing. And my question is this really adequate? In other words, it's true that there is definitely a fictive aspect to historical writing. It cannot be denied. And can be seen in many ways. But at the same time, by overemphasizing this idea, and I have several quotes of Hayden White, who goes, I think, the furthest in this kind of post-Nietzschean way of denying or minimizing, let's say, the difference between historical narrative and fiction.
Yeah.
And I think that the question then would be, does this not put us in danger of also minimizing the difference between accepted historiography of the pre-World War II period, which was so influenced by a political mythology that is easily identifiable, the kind of culture history that was very predominant at Columbia University, for example, or other institutions like that, and was really predominant in the United States. Are we not minimizing the difference between that kind of accepted historiography and the revisionist movement that later pointed out its inadequacies? It seems to me that that it's very important to point out, and here I share the viewpoint of Paul Ricoeur, who wrote a short treatise called The Reality of the Historical Past. And I share his idea. It's a critical idea of Hayden White and of Roland Barthes, that in fact, certain kinds of historiography they don't retrieve the historical past as such, as some kind of a presence that was there to those who lived it, but it can retrieve a measure of the reality, a certain aspect of the reality of the historical past that is very different from the kind of fictional mythologies that are disseminated in other forms of historiography. And so I think it's extremely important to keep that distinction as a theoretical distinction in mind.
And I think that's absolutely right. It's also, I think, the case that American historiography was for a long time guided by, sort of narrative myths of the American founding and so on. And there was a kind of fixation on the presidency and certain um, and the Congress and government institutions of that kind are sort of personality focused. And so I suppose part of what Hayden White's revisionist historiography was a reaction against that kind of mythicizing historiography. But
I agree. I mean, I think that I don't want to be too critical of him, because I think that he was reacting against a kind of positivist position, which took, historiography to actually kind of retrieve historical reality, which is kind of, and to forget completely all of the devices that Roland Barthes points out, all the devices that historians use. He uses Michelet as a very good example, if they use, that are really drawn from historical novels and from fictional accounts, and that could never really have been witnessed in any way. And I think that it was very important. I'm not saying that what they did and the criticism that they leveled against an earlier current of positivist historians was not legitimate. But I think that in turn, when you look at Hayden White's The Content of the Form, and you see that in Exergue, he puts in, the motto of the book is taken from Nietzsche, that the facts have a linguistic validity. I think that he goes a little too far, and I think he himself recognized that. He wrote
yeah,
Metahistory, and he wrote these articles, and I actually had a long conversation with him about 2 years before he died. We had a long, and he said that he himself thought he'd gone too far. He had not seen really the implications of certain of the statements he was making. And so I think it's not really to criticize him in that way, but simply to say that it's very important to make certain kinds of distinctions between certain kinds of historiography.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, there are a lot more things that we could discuss, but I do want to allow time for questions from the audience. I also want to recommend to the audience Jeffrey's book here, Collective Memory and the Historical Past, in which some of the issues he's discussed today are raised. It was published by University of Chicago Press in 2016. But why don't we open it now? Because we have about 10 minutes left. Why don't we open it to Q&A from the audience, which Anthony will be moderating.
Sure thing. And just to clarify, so I'm just switching another screen off so it doesn't interfere. Just to clarify, we've got more than 10 minutes. We got at least 20 minutes and we may be able to go over. So feel free to chip in with more questions. There's a nice mixture of questions. Some of them are a bit more in-depth, some of them are a bit more what you call nuts and bolts. So let's just start with some of the nuts and bolts ones. An anonymous attendee asks, please can you clarify the term historiography? I kind of know what it means, but also kind of don't. Thanks. So Jeffrey, do you want to
Yeah, that's an excellent question because it's used in many different ways. I think it's a good question because the term historiography is often used in imprecise ways. I think it should be made precise. Historiography can normally, the first meaning has to do with simply the writing of history and the methods that historians use to write history. What is it that historiography means? What is it that is distinctive in historical writing that distinguishes it from other kinds of writing? But of course, this historiography is also taken a very extended sense, oftentimes in universities, to talk about historical theory more generally, which I think is also permissible. But I think the first use is the clearest.
Okay, so I think the standard format is to ask Nick if he wants to follow up, but assuming Jeffrey hasn't said anything terribly controversial there, I guess you'll probably want to move on to the next question.
There are some things I would like to ask. Why don't you, Anthony, if there's another question from the audience, we'll let Jeffrey address that. And then I will, there's a question I wanted to ask in particular about passive presence. But let's take an audience question first.
Okay, well, on the very topic of passive presence, then there's two questions that seem on the face of it to ask kind of the same thing. So Joe asks, where do you draw the distinction between an active and passive presence of the historical past? And Alexander asks, can you clarify what you mean by the historical past and what is the distinction between anxiety over the passive presence of that past and anxiety over its active presence?
Well, good questions. I would say that the notion of passivity, I take it directly from phenomenology, from Edmund Husserl. And Edmund Husserl, in talking about passivity, makes a very good point, which I think he says that you never have a pure passivity. Passivity also always engages a certain degree of activity, and activity always engages a certain degree of passivity. So it's more of a kind of a spectrum going from one to the other, and it's a kind of a mixture of the two. And so if it were totally passive, then it would not be retrievable. The idea that you can retrieve it means that it is at least potentially active. And at the same time, when it's active, you say it's active, there are also aspects of it that belong to its context that are not necessarily retrieved actively, but remain passive. In other words, aspects of the past that you're focusing on that nonetheless are not entirely brought into question or into investigation. And so I think that it's very important. The question is important precisely because it's not a sharp distinction, but rather a spectrum, a distinction that becomes more concentrated or less concentrated, as Husserl very well said. The second part of the question was, about the passive and active. Um, what I mean by why I chose the anxiety in relation to the passive presence of the historical past is precisely because of the contingency. And I use the word contingency to say that in very unexpected ways, things that we think we have overcome or that we have put into the past that no longer belong to assumptions of the present, all of a sudden they can reappear in ways that we are not expecting. They're contingent in that sense. They're unexpected, accidental, and they're triggered by something. I think of the famous marches in the South of the United States over monuments in Richmond, Virginia, for example, in 2018. And this, who in the world in 2015 or 14 would have expected that that would have happened? I mean, it was something during the Obama administration when it would have been hard to envisage. And so all of a sudden it came back, all of this came back, and we were confronted with something that we were not at all expecting and that was very anxiety provoking, I think to many, many people for good reason. And so I think that the idea of passivity and why the anxiety belongs to passivity is precisely the contingency, the unexpectedness, the way in which things that we expected to occur in a certain way, in fact, did not occur in that way at all, and put us back to square one in certain ways. Nick, do you have something to add to that?
No, I wanted to. It's related to that, and it's really a distinction. And I know this is something you discuss in the book, but I did want to bring it out because when we hear things like passive presence and a kind of psychical trauma that the passive presence of the past can produce, we might be inclined to think, oh, this is like Freud's idea of the return of the repressed. And so it may be worth distinguishing a bit this kind of thing in the historical past from Freud's idea of the resurfacing of repressed material from psychical history, because Freud conceives both collective and individual repressed material.
That's an excellent point. One in my book, I make it very precise that I'm not dealing with psychological issues, and I distinguish it because for Freud, for example, the unconscious that he's dealing with is something that is not historical at all. And what interested him is not really the historical aspects of experience, but rather the underlying unconscious and non-historical archetypes and symbols. For me, I'm very much more interested in the historicity of human experience. In other words, the ways in which what we take to be evident and true in one period change markedly in another period. That certain periods believe in God, and belief in God is the central aspect defining a whole period, and other periods can question those beliefs. In other words, the most fundamental beliefs, certain periods believe, all of a sudden begin believing that all human beings are equal. In other words, the framers of our Constitution said, we take these truths to be self-evident. They're not self-evident. They're truths that are historically contingent. And I think that's a very important point. And they can be changed, and they can be, democracy is very precarious for that very reason. That the truths are not self-evident, and that there is not a human nature that upon which they can be based, but that we must, through our will, activate what we take to be ethically true, and be able to defend it without any kind of banister or basis in ready assumptions about human nature or about self-evident truths, because what is self-evident changes historically. That's the point I'm trying to make. And that's why it's not psychological.
which also means that symbols aren't endowed with some kind of autonomous agency. They always have to be activated actively. They exist passively, but they become reactivated actively.
Precisely, precisely. It's not the symbols of the interpretation of dreams, but it is rather the symbolic ways in which we constitute space and time, for example. The way in which all of our spatial relations in the everyday world are symbolically configured. I know right away when I walk outside the difference between a private yard and a public space. You know, all of these spaces are designated in such ways. In temporal ways, I know the difference between market days and days, Sundays, for example, in which people don't work. And all of these are socially instituted, and they're all symbolically configured, but they're not, so to speak, psychological in the Freudian sense.
Okay, so there's a question here from Alice. It's got a sort of a punchiness to it. Is the historian primarily in the business of myth making or truth telling, or is this a false dichotomy?
No, it's not a false dichotomy at all. And I think it depends in large measure on the historian. And I think that what is really important, I mean, truth telling is, of course, going a long way. I mean, we're all claiming to speak in terms of truth, but I think that there are certain forms of control that make certain forms of historical narrative much better than others. And those forms of control are a willingness to take into consideration contradictory points of view that are not our points of view, showing why, you know, because as I said, we're talking about a fragmented reality. That reality is not presented as something monolithic, and truths are not simply given as big blocks, but we all have fragmented perspectives on reality. We differ from each other. The groups we belong to differ from other groups. And so what makes an historical narrative better than another is the ability to take into consideration a plurality of different groups, to put oneself in the place of another, and to explain why the historical narrative that we are defending in fact is better than other possible explanations. If we present things dogmatically, then we're beginning, and we don't take into consideration what other people and what other groups in their fragmented perspectives believe and may argue is true, and show why there might be deficiencies in these arguments. If we're not willing to do this, then we fall into myth making. And I think it's very important. Here I'm working right now on the question of the mass media and how the mass media can very much influence this aspect of myth making, but that's another topic.
I was going to say before asking if Nick wants to follow up that actually Elka has asked a question, how has technology affected the nature of myth treatment? So if you wanted to sort of follow that lead, you're very welcome to do so in service of Elka's question.
Yeah, that's the central question that I'm working on right now. Because I think that the argument I already present in my book, but I'm going much, much further in what I'm working on now, is that what I call taking into consideration a plurality of perspectives has to do with what I call what normally is called context. In other words, contextualizing means taking into consideration different perspectives. And the danger, of course, is that the new kinds of technology, here I'm thinking of certain algorithms, I'm thinking of many forms of social media that rely on algorithms. They in fact decontextualize. They have a tendency to concentrate on the question of predicting what will happen in the future based on the present, on a huge volume of data that indicate what will happen. But the question is not centered on a context itself. It's centered on what, it's not even centered on the question of what is true or false. It's centered on what users' tendencies are and how these users' tendencies will be extended in the future. And I think that the way of decontextualizing experience in general that often takes place in the mass media, and especially, well, social media, etc., as opposed to really good investigative reporting, this in fact falls easily prey to political mythologies. And I think this is the main danger today. I'm not saying that algorithms necessarily fall into this trap, but that the people who use them don't necessarily have in mind this specific danger.
The
Thank
thing
you,
I'd
Jeff.
add to,
Oh yeah,
sorry,
sorry, go.
Anthony, the thing I wanted to add to that is that, of course, because these algorithmic systems are based on identifying likenesses, they're also self-reinforcing. And that's another example of that decontextualizing. So then they become, in effect, their own myths. But they're also radically opposed to contingency in the sense that because they predict that you will like this, because you have liked this, they also exclude alternatives.
Exactly.
And that's what makes them.
Exactly.
And so you have this competition then of mutually exclusive worldviews promoted algorithmically instead of a
exactly the
genuine
point.
public sphere. And that raises the question of whether historiography can have any kind of opening into a public sphere that's so constituted, or does historiography itself have to resort to myth making?
That's a really difficult issue.
I mean,
That's
explicit myth making as opposed to what Hayden White said. This is something even more radical than what Hayden White had argued.
Yeah, it reminds me of an essay of Hannah Arendt, Truth and Politics, where she deals precisely that. Why not found a society on myths? She's saying, why not make up the past? Certain tendencies in Soviet Russia, for example, the past was simply made up. Trotsky was taken out of pictures of Stalin and Lenin, where they had a group picture, this sort of a thing. And the past is simply rewritten. And so Hannah Arendt's question is, well, why not? Isn't it more comfortable? Can't we live much more comfortably in this way? And of course, her answer is that this is an extremely, extremely dangerous tendency, precisely because, and she doesn't use the word passive presence of the past, but she comes close to what I'm trying to say when she says that you can't eradicate. Things happen. You may try to eradicate them or shunt them aside, but they're always there. I would say passively. They're always there. They're always there in the documents. They're there. Trotsky's photos were in the archives, and they were here and they were there. And all of a sudden, when they begin to emerge and they become evident, somebody activates them, it destabilizes the whole society. And I think that point is extremely that stability in the society, and the stability means the ability to accept certain ideas, certain facts as true. And instability and decontextualization is precisely the skepticism that arises when we're led to question everything. Everything becomes a conspiracy. Everything becomes, and there's no stable basis for truth. There's no Archimedean point, so to speak. And I think Hannah Arendt makes this point, and I think that is really important. And to your question, Nick, I don't really have an answer, because I think that we need really to evolve an answer. We have to find a way of introducing a kind of pluralistic approach to the truth and to historical events in social media and in the different sources of information that we use.